Hi guys, my name's Tom. Thanks for joining me. I've had quite a big break from YouTube for the last kind of 6 weeks or so. I've had a lot of messages from people asking if I am going to be doing more videos. Yes, I've got loads more videos planned. This first little flurry of videos is going to be me simply releasing a few older bits from Patreon. I'm going to be talking a little bit about theory and then how we apply that to some painting. I've got plenty more kind of longer length videos and longer tutorials coming up. If any of this stuff is of interest to you, I do have a Patreon page. I also have an online watercolour school which should be launching at the end of March. This is 2022 if you're watching this way down the line. So feel free to hop over and look at my Patreon page. There's still new stuff to come up there. But once I hop over to the online watercolour school, a lot of that stuff will also move over there so you can see it. One more thing I would like to take a moment to talk about is that I have upcoming later this year a Watercolour Masterclass series. You can find out loads more information on this over on my website as well as book your place now. I'm really excited about this series. It's going to be a fantastic way for people to really learn everything they need to know to significantly improve their watercolour painting. I hope to see you there, and also I hope that you enjoy this video. Let's dive in. So what I want to talk to you here about is something that you can apply to any subject. We're going to start very simply, and still life is the perfect example of that. It's just very, very simple shapes. So it's super obvious, but we've got very, very simple shapes there. And then if we just treat this as, you know, a very simple shape initially. Beyond that, I then want to start thinking about tonal values. So this is if we look at our subject as if it were black and white and we're looking for light and shadow. At least in my mind, it makes it a lot easier to paint. You could split this down there. This is kind of the shadow side. It makes it so much simpler because we don't have to then think for a moment, oh, there's blue reflected light in there. It can get very complicated. Look at all these variations of tone and colour in here and all this subtlety. We've got reflected light bouncing back in there. All of this stuff which can kind of distract us. At least initially when we're thinking about our subject, just think of it like this. We can even apply it to, you know, the big cloth down here. It's just a big light shape, and within it we just have some smaller shapes of shadow. That's it. The table itself is just a big light shape, but it has some smaller kind of shapes of shadow within it. Pretty straightforward, not particularly hard concept. What works particularly well for watercolour for me, I find, is thinking about the light family as being one large group of tonal values that has maybe a highlight within it, and then it has all of these lovely subtle halftones, or you can really let the paint flow together as long as it stays light. And then notably separate from that, we have the shadow family, and the shadow family might be made up again of a little variety of tones, but I tried to keep my tonal values very kind of compact and dense in the shadow family and keep it tonally separate from the light family so that the painting kind of holds together well and we get a strong pattern of light and shadow. I literally just split every shape, whatever it represented, into a light family. And within that light family, we have that little variation of tone and then maybe a highlight within it. The shadow family, as I said, I keep it much tighter. There's only really 2 tones in there. We also, of course, have room to go to what I would call a dark accent. And in some cases, this deep dark might represent just one of the shadow tones. In other times, it might be like a little dark accent that just gets slotted into different places. So the only other thing I wanted to mention is it's interesting for me how, look what represents the lighter tonal value, so this colour or this tone on the reflected side of the red vase, take that tone, which looks quite light in the shadow area, but then I take that and put it in the light area, it's actually a very, very dark tone. Our mind can play tricks on us, and one of those tricks is that the lighter tonal values here are the same as the tone of the reflected light there, but we've seen that they are not at all. The reflected light in this case is actually a lot darker, and so what we end up with then is this very dominant boundary between the light family and the shadow family, and that boundary is really important. Not every single subject do we want it, you know, misty mornings or more kind of soft high key paintings, we don't want that, but generally if we're trying to create a bit of light and shadow, a very strong form, then good separation of light and shadow family is key. And you can see that tells us, it's very crude, but it tells us all the information we need to know in order to see our subject. The only real anomaly here is this little bit here. It's kind of not quite dark enough to be considered part of the shadow family, not quite light enough to be part of the light family, but it doesn't really matter. We don't need to obsess about these things. These are not hard, fast rules. And actually, if we were just to state very simply that it is just a shadow, and there again is a shadow, it just in this case happens to be a bit of an outlier from our kind of strong patterns of light and shadow here. So let's kind of look at how we're going to apply that in a painting. So the very loose theory here is that this first wash, and this is a painting of kind of two parts, doesn't always have to be like this, but this first wash is basically kind of painting the light family. Of course you can carry on working wet into wet and go straight into the shadow family, but this, as I said, is kind of a painting of two parts, and it's a nice way to approach a watercolour. So what I'm kind of doing here is trying to create the gentle form and all of those sort of subtle halftones within the light side, as well as reserving the whites of the page. I really want to let all of the colours run here. You almost can't go too wrong as long as you keep it light. People run into trouble, myself included, when I go too dark too quickly. That dark then starts creeping into the light area and all of our tones kind of end up meeting in the middle, whereas as we've seen, we really want to keep those tonal values separate, the shadow family and the light family. That said, I am starting with a very watery pigment, and then as that first wash is drying, I'm dropping in increasingly stronger, thicker paint coming up to kind of full fat milk, maybe even single cream paint consistency. The idea is that I am still trying to create a sense of form so that these 3D shapes move from having a highlight and a light side to maybe having a slightly darker side, so that we do get some sense of form already. Now that it's almost dry on that vase on the left, I feel okay to start dropping in thicker, stronger pigment and start pushing those darks deeper. That really accentuates the form. If I'd done it any sooner, that dark would have bled into the light side and we may have ended up with kind of not that dark, not that light, somewhere in the middle. Because of my timing with dropping that dark into the vase, it only kind of bled a little bit around the form of the subject, and if anything kind of helped with the rounded feeling, but it didn't bleed so far. So if you squint your eyes, there's still a very definite boundary between the light side and the shadow side of that kind of pinky vase. That's ultimately what we're aiming for here. It doesn't matter what style you work in, what subject you're painting, how realistic you want to paint, how abstract you want to paint, all of that stuff, how loose, how tight. It's all the same principles. And so now the background is a bit more freeform. You could do a very flat dark background, but I wanted to give it a little bit more kind of life to it. So I washed in a deep dark and then I splattered a bit of opaque paint in there. This area in the bottom left corner, notice I start with the very dominant shadow shape. I leave some of the white of the page, or the initial lighter wash, which has now dried, to represent the light. So we've done all of the flowing light areas. I'm now painting the shadows over the top. And for me, this kind of area, I don't want it to dominate too much. I actually just start chucking a lot of the water around, letting all the paint flow together. As long as I get some sense of there being a light family and some sense of there being a shadow family, this area I feel much more comfortable being far more abstract. And for me, this is what this idea of strong patterns of light and shadow and very separate differentiation between light and shadow, that really gives you the freedom to play around with the paint, to paint a lot more loose, to paint a lot more abstract. For me, it's the key to working in this sort of way. And this is also a great example of how tonal values give the structure of the painting. And if you have like a solid composition and the tonal values are holding it together and making it work and giving it structure, you really can let rip with the paint over the top. This is a good example also of how we can let a lot of the forms kind of flow and meld together if we want to, particularly in the shadows. You can do it any way around, but in this particular painting, notice how the light family, the edges are kind of sharper, more defined, And then as I move around the form of these objects into the shadow area, that's where I'm losing a lot of the edges. We're getting much more lost and soft edges. The background is merging into the objects and vice versa. And it's this kind of idea of soft shadows and hard lights. So again, the light is providing the sharpness and the more refined areas, gives the eye something to kind of focus on. The shadows is where everything's kind of flowing together and we're losing edges, we're being more abstract, we're being a lot more soft and lost with our form. Again, what underpins that idea and underpins that principle and allows me to make it work is having thought ahead of time where the strong shadows are, where the strong lights are. That's going to be a recurring theme of this. You can see that I'm slowly bringing in those little dark accents as well. Those little dark accents, those little sharper shapes of dark, just in select places can really make an area a pop. They just give a little bit more of a strong edge where it's needed. As we were saying in the theory, the jug is slightly different. It's not as simple as there is a light side and a shadow side, but actually in some ways it's a little bit easier to paint because we can just sort of follow these quite easy to understand kind of increments of tone as we go around the different planes of the jug. So we're still thinking light and shadow, we're still thinking tone, but we're thinking a little bit more subtly and a bit more of subtle jumps of tone around the plane of the jug. You can also notice that as well as being much more free with the paint, allowing the tone to underpin and hold everything together, if you get your tone working and you get your tonal values right, you look to paint light and shadow, you can see that you can kind of do whatever you want with the colour. Yeah, I've kind of taken my colours and my ideas from the subject very clearly, but at the same time I've not been afraid to push the subject a little bit more in terms of colour, maybe push the colour a little bit stronger or create colours that aren't necessarily there, like the vase has got much more purple, much more blue in it in the shadows than the kind of more muted colours of the photo. I've probably made the right side of the, sorry I meant the jug there, the right side of the red vase is much lighter than it is in the photo, but for me that again accentuates the light and shadow and accentuates the form. And then notice how obviously the red from the pears has bled into the blue of the table and created some really interesting stuff. You know, I didn't necessarily intend that to happen, but I know that if I put a bit of shadow back over the top of that, that will give us enough structure and enough information. And I'm now going into that pear in the foreground and really strengthening that strong shadow side. And I think it just needed that to make it pop. We've now got a very obvious light side, very obvious shadow side. This last little bit of the painting is really just popping on little bits of detail here. It's how dark do I want to go in places? How many little details do I want to put in? Is there anywhere I can get a little bit more texture in? This negative shape between the handle and the jug itself is obviously really important. Notice I kind of put it in a bit light and then I load it with darker colour as I go, using it to really trap the shape of the jug. And again, the front edge in particular of the handle of the jug is getting hit by light, just like the rim of the jug is getting hit by light. So those edges are very, very sharp and hard and defined. And then notice as we drift around into the shadows in any part of the jug, that it really starts to kind of everything merges together. You can't quite tell where one part of the jug becomes another. Everything sort of softens together. Last few touches here, just kind of really making sure I get the negative shape around the red vase. That little shot of red just reflecting into the jug is a nice little touch. All of these are the little finishing touches, the little decorations, the little kind of flourishes, all the fun bits on top. But all of these fun bits on top can only work if we've laid the foundations of light and shadow, of the tonal values. The tonal values are the glue that hold the painting together, or you can think of them as the really solid foundations of a house, and then the tonal values are building up the house and giving it the structure. And then only when all of that is in place can we start to add all of the exciting little decorations and the individual touches that make the painting our own. So there we have it. Really happy with that as a final piece. Let's compare it to our very initial kind of theory section and see how we got on. So there we go. I hope that you can see, comparing the reference, my kind of little tonal study, and then the final painting, you can see the similarities and the importance of the tone, and also how that underlying tone allowed me to be a lot more free, a lot more loose with the paint, to really kind of let rip, especially in the looser areas and those shadow shapes, knowing that if there were certain areas where I was a bit more careful with strong patterns of light and shadow and quite accurate shapes, that it could afford me that kind of freedom. If we look at the vase on the left side, the red one, although the form is a little bit more merged than the tonal study I did, if I really squint, I can still very much see there's a shadow side and a light side. We've even got a hint of that kind of reflected light, even though it's a slightly more abstract version. Equally, the kind of the sort of tea towel in the bottom left hand corner, I've kind of got the pattern of light and shadow. There's a very obvious kind of lighter shadow, and then there's the light of the initial wash, the light family. Again, because there's that kind of understanding of light and shadow, it's allowed me to just kind of let rip in that area and do whatever. And then on the jug, again, if I squint my eyes, I can very clearly see that there is a light side and a shadow side with a few of those little increments in between. And then of course on the pears in the bottom right hand corner, yes, there's a huge amount of differences. Not all the tones have stayed in exactly the same place, but that's what I love about watercolour, and that's what I love about painting. It doesn't have to be, if we don't want it to be, a literal copy of the photo. It can be, or our reference, whatever it is, it can be inspired by our reference. It can be the jumping off point for our painting, the reference can be, and then we can kind of take it in its own direction. We can then use tonal values to help us anchor the painting back down, or if we're struggling to know how to make the painting work, those are always our tools to fall back on. I hope you enjoyed that, guys. Do be sure to check out the links in the description. Please do consider subscribing, because there's loads more videos to come. Hit the like button, drop me a comment, all of that stuff. I look forward to catching you in the next video. See you soon.